In the morning of February 23, 2003, students and staff of a primary school located in the Hunan province city Xiangtan were attending the regular Monday morning flag-raising ceremony. The absence of one of the school's teachers, however, had gone unnoticed. 21-year-old music teacher Huang Jing was lying dead in her teacher's dormitory accommodation. The death of Huang Jing would result in a 5-year legal battle for justice, 6 autopsies, and would become known as one of the first cases in China where the internet would play a large part in trying to get to the truth. Principal of the school Dai Cairong, as he did every Monday morning, was overseeing the ceremony when the teacher alongside him pointed out a man rushing to approach them. The man quickly walking towards them was well known to the principal. He was Jiang Juwu, the boyfriend of music teacher Huang Jing. Principal Dai Cairong had actually introduced the pair to each other before they became a couple. The principal could see by the look on the face of Jiang Juwu that something was troubling him. Somewhat panicked, the boyfriend told the principal that he'd been unable to contact Huang Jing, and that she'd had some kind of accident. Dai Cairong headed to the dormitory with the boyfriend and some other female teachers to investigate. Reaching the room, they knocked on the door calling out to her, but received no response. Phone calls were still going unanswered, and teachers in neighboring rooms hadn't seen her that morning. Concerned and needing to get the door open, a maintenance worker was sent to the dorm room directly above, and lowered himself down on a rope to the balcony of the room of Huang Jing, to let the others in. Opening the door, the worker told the people gathered that teacher Huang Jing was lying on the bed, and he believed she was dead. While school principal Dai Cairong entered the room with the worker to check on Huang Jing, Jiang Juwu and the other teachers waited outside. Looking down at the music teacher, Dai Cairong saw her lying flat on her back, the quilt pulled up to her chin, her eyes slightly open. She showed no signs of life, and the emergency services were called. When the medical team arrived at the school, they made attempts to resuscitate Huang Jing, even though it was apparent she'd been dead for some time. Once the police and forensic examiner arrived, they began inspecting the room. There was no sign of forced entry and the room was tidy, apart from several crumpled up tissues lying on the floor next to the bed. But when looking at the body, things began to appear somewhat suspicious. The quilt covering Huang Jing was laid out neatly over her, and seemingly hadn't been disturbed overnight, as if she remained motionless once she'd gotten into bed. Removing the quilt to examine the body, she was found to be completely naked. It was winter, and the average temperature the previous day was only 7.3 degrees centigrade, or a little over 45 degrees Fahrenheit, in a room with no heating. It seemed unlikely that Huang Jing would have chosen to sleep that way. There were obvious traces of semen on her stomach, but no sign of any fatal injury or choking. No blood was present anywhere in the room, but the back of the victim's knee showed significant bruising. While the examination of the body continued, police began to question Jiang Juwu, the last confirmed person to see Huang Jing alive. He told police that the previous night they'd attended his friend's birthday celebration, and ended up staying later than intended, Huang Jing falling asleep on his friend's sofa as he played mahjong. He'd eventually brought her back to the dormitory at around 3 in the morning, and the pair got into bed together naked. He made an attempt to initiate intercourse, but Huang Jing was a virgin at the time, and said she wanted to wait until they were married. Instead, they indulged in some very heavy petting, and he ejaculated on her stomach. He left at 6:50 in the morning, returning home to get ready for work. He tried calling her, but his calls were ignored. Concerned she had a problem, he decided to return to the school. His story didn't seem quite right to the police. They thought it a little strange that he'd immediately assumed there'd been some sort of accident when his calls weren't answered, given that Huang Jing was supposed to have started work. Speaking to other people present, suspicions about the boyfriend grew. The school principal, very much like the police, found it unusual that Jiang Juwu quickly came to the assumption that Huang Jing must have had some kind of accident. But statements from the female teachers present at the time would really make police look closely at the boyfriend. Once the door of the room was opened, it was noted that he'd made no attempt to go inside and check on his girlfriend of 10 months. Instead, he walked away, sitting alone in the corridor stairwell, at no time asking about the condition of Huang Jing. Dissatisfied with his story, police detained him for further questioning. Jiang Juwu was being taken to the local police station when the parents of Huang Jing arrived at the scene, having been informed of their daughter's death by the school. Unlike the boyfriend, the parents entered the room where their daughter was lying dead immediately, and there seeing the naked body, the case became somewhat murky. Huang Jing was eventually moved to the medical examiner's office to try and ascertain the cause of death. However, before it was moved, Mother Huang Shuhua claimed she noticed a number of very obvious unexplained injuries. Jiang Juwu took investigators through the events of that day at the police station. He'd been out with Huang Jing to celebrate his friend's birthday. Picking her up from the school at around 7 in the evening, they'd gone out to attend a meal. After the meal, they went to the friend's home with a few other people to play mahjong. Huang Jing didn't participate, she just sat on the sofa, eventually falling asleep, while the men played into the early hours. He decided to leave at 2 in the morning, and carried the still sleepy Huang Jing from his friend's 5th-floor apartment to his car outside. They arrived at the school at around 2:50 in the morning, both going to her dorm room. They then indulged in some adult activity, stopping short of full-blown intercourse, before falling asleep together, him leaving 4 hours later. The majority of the story had been confirmed by other people at the birthday celebration and those he'd played mahjong with. However, he hadn't given any explanation for the bruising discovered on the back of the victim's knees. With his statement not explaining how Huang Jing received the injuries in an unusual location, he amended his story a little, claiming that while she was sleeping, he tried to pry the legs of Huang Jing apart, failing to initiate intercourse, and that could have caused the marks. With no fatal injuries on the body, or signs of suffocation or choking, homicide was fairly quickly ruled out as the cause of death. Instead, the medical examiner put it down to illness, his verdict being that it was caused by hanbizheng, without performing an autopsy. The condition isn't something that would be often diagnosed by medical practitioners outside China. When translated directly into English, it would simply mean joint pain. However, in traditional Chinese medicine, it refers to the supposed illness, cold paralysis. Practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine will claim the cause is down to an imbalance in an individual's qi. The closest equivalent to the condition in Western medicine being rheumatoid arthritis. Even people who believe in the concept of qi, and those who subscribe to the efficacy of traditional Chinese medicine, would find it shocking that cold paralysis could cause the sudden death of a young woman. The parents of Huang Jing were extremely unhappy with the verdict. Their daughter was an outwardly healthy young woman, with no diagnosed medical issues. There were also the numerous unexplained injuries the mother of Huang Jing claimed she saw on the body, which were left out of the medical examiner's report. Both parents found it inexplicable that their daughter could just drop dead with no obvious cause, and demanded a full autopsy be performed as soon as possible. The police also found the story of the boyfriend unconvincing, agreeing the death needed further investigation, so the local medical office was ordered to carry out a full autopsy. Ready to question Jiang Juwu once more, they looked into his background and that of Huang Jing more closely. Born on September 27, 1982 in Xiangtan City, Huang Jing had graduated from Hunan First Provincial College before taking a job as a music teacher in Yinfeng Primary School. She was something of a gifted musician, being able to play the violin, flute, and piano to a very high standard. She also had her own composition called Our Wish, published on an album titled Children's Music. While teaching, she was also taking a long-distance learning course with the Central Conservatory for Music to obtain a degree. Along with her musical ability, she was a talented writer, having several articles and short stories published in the local newspaper and a number of magazines. At only 21 years of age, she was already the director of the local Xiangtan Music Association and Music Society, and looked to be a young woman with a bright future. In the May of 2002, She was introduced to Jiang Juwu by the principal of the Yifeng Primary School, who thought the pair would be a good match. Jiang Juwu was 4 years older than Huang Jing, and was working for the local taxation bureau when they were introduced. He came from what was considered a good family, his father a researcher at the taxation bureau, and his mother an active member of her local village committee. They began a relationship soon after meeting, and by February 2003 looked to be on course to marry, having introduced each other to their respective parents, which pretty much amounts to an engagement in China. When police asked friends of both Huang Jing and Jiang Juwu about the couple's relationship, they were told no one knew of any issues between them. They seemed like a happy young couple, preparing to spend the rest of their lives together. In the case of Huang Jing, that would tragically turn out to be true. On February 25th, the Huang family got their wish of a full autopsy, while the police questioned Jiang Juwu once more. This time the boyfriend's story changed. He now claimed the bruising behind the knees of Huang Jing was probably caused when he carried her down 5 floors when leaving his friend's home. He then claimed that while sleeping he was woken suddenly by Huang Jing having a seizure. She twitched violently for several minutes and began foaming at the mouth. Getting over the shock, having never seen her do this before, he tried to help her. Once it was over, he asked if she needed to go to hospital. She replied saying it was okay, and she was fine. The significant changes in his story did little to lessen police suspicions about him. They had more questions they wanted answers to, and he was detained until the results of the autopsy were announced. The autopsy came back with the conclusion that Huang Jing died of acute heart and lung failure, caused by a sudden heart attack. The parents of Huang Jing were once again unhappy with the results. There was still no mention of the various marks allegedly seen on the body, and as far as they knew, their daughter had no underlying health issues. Claims the death was down to natural causes was also brought into question due to Huang Jing being a teacher. Teachers in China at all levels are required to take physical examinations every 2 years, although most schools do it annually. The health check includes a chest X-ray, ultrasound examination for the internal organs, hearing and eye tests, dental examinations, blood and urine samples tested, and undergoing an ECG to check for heart issues. In a case where an issue with the heart is diagnosed, an individual will not be allowed to take up a teaching position until the problem is corrected. While Huang Jing being given a clean bill of health from the physical exam didn't guarantee there wasn't an underlying problem, it certainly made the idea of her death being down to a heart attack seem highly questionable. However, when police spoke to colleagues of Huang Jing, one recalled a recent incident. The fellow teacher told police about a time Huang Jing came to her home for lunch. The music teacher went to lie down for an afternoon nap after eating. A short while later, Huang Jing weakly stumbled towards the living room, drenched in sweat, needing to use the wall to hold herself up. Saying she wasn't feeling well, she asked her colleague to massage her back. The colleague, very concerned about the appearance of Huang Jing, did so, and soon enough she recovered. However, the colleague was shocked to later see how much sweat had pooled on the sofa Huang Jing slept, saying it was as if someone had poured a jug of water on it. This incident was the only independent evidence to suggest a health issue, supporting the medical office's claim. But numerous other colleagues and friends gave police an image of someone in excellent health. To go along with her musical ability, Huang Jing was also a keen dancer, and participated in the school's teachers' sporting events. She'd taken part in the event's 400 and 800-meter races, as well as other competitions, the school's physical education teacher stating she looked to be in good physical condition. Unwilling to accept the autopsy results, the parents demanded another from a different medical examiner. The local authority would eventually agree, but it would have to be paid for by the Huang family. The death of Huang Jing had been ascribed to natural causes twice, and as a result the police were unable to treat it as a criminal case. Therefore, as a civil case, the family of Huang Jing needed to cover the cost of the autopsy themselves, as well as storage of their daughter's body, which cost 240 yuan per day. Desperate to find out how their daughter died, the parents of Huang Jing dug into their life savings for another autopsy. On the 19th of March 2003, the second autopsy was performed and would confuse the issue more, claiming a different cause of death. Again, it was put down to natural causes, but this time it was said to be because of a pulmonary infarction. Unsurprisingly, the parents of Huang Jing were again not prepared to accept that explanation. However, time was seemingly running out for them to get the answers they desired. With 2 autopsies putting the death down to natural causes, they were sent a notice of cremation, stating that the body couldn't be kept indefinitely and would have to be laid to rest soon. The parents fought for another autopsy to be performed, and went to a lawyer who filed an injunction to stop the body from being destroyed. In a hopeful attempt to get what she believed would be justice for her daughter, Huang Shuhua found help online. In 2003, the internet was still very much in its infancy in China, even more so in areas outside of the major cities. Smartphones weren't a thing, and few people would have their own personal computer at home. The mysterious death of Huang Jing had been reported extensively in the local city press, and had begun to get more attention in the wider provincial media. The reporting of the case led to people online taking notice, and online discussion groups emerged. One person who'd read about the case and was following it carefully was an internet user who went under the online name Chasers in the Wind and lived in the neighboring city Shaoyang. He'd set up an online memorial for Huang Jing, named Tiantang Huayuan, meaning Paradise Garden, where people discussed the case. Huang Shuhua had come across the site, and in efforts to further publicize her plight began sharing information with Chasers in the Wind, including official reports given to her by the police. From the moment she saw Huang Jing lying dead, Huang Shuhua was convinced her daughter had her life ended after being violated, and this led to one of the most contentious issues in the case. From day one, Huang Shuhua maintained that on viewing her daughter's body, she'd noticed numerous injuries inflicted on her, even making a list of what she'd seen. While the unexplained deep bruising in the knee pits of Huang Jing was not in question, photographic evidence being published in the newspapers, there was no verification for the other alleged marks. However, a list of the supposed injuries would be published on the Paradise Garden Memorial. It claimed there were more than 36 marks on the victim's right leg. These would include cigarette burns, needle puncture wounds, and bruising. On the left leg there were allegedly around 33 marks, described in the same manner. The unverified report went on to describe bruising and scratches to both hands of the victim. Furthermore, there were supposedly abrasions and marks on the neck and both ears, along with swelling and bruising to the back, buttocks, and perineum. The list of supposed injuries garnered a lot of attention online, and the Paradise Garden Memorial soon gained a following of 210,000 people, which was a fairly significant number for the time. It is important to state, however, that the list of injuries came from Huang Shuhua, who had no medical training or knowledge. Just a distraught mother, looking at the naked corpse of her daughter, and the injuries would not be verified in any of the autopsies. Huang Shuhua had requested photographs of her daughter's body from the medical examiner's office, but was rejected. The only photos released were of the bruising to the back of the knees, and an image of the hands, which were unmarked, and so refuted some of the mother's claims. Nevertheless, for followers of the case there was enough suspicion for people to take action, and a petition was sent to the higher-level provincial government to perform a third autopsy. Several prominent scholars added their names to the petition, and crucially a pair of documentary makers got involved. University professor of gender studies, Ai Xiaoming, who already had a number of published works and books, read about the case in the media and instantly became attracted to it. She teamed up with documentarian Hu Jie, who had previously served in the military and was a captain in the Chinese Air Force, to investigate the case. With the story gaining more traction in the national media, a large online petition and several prominent influential people openly voicing support for the Huang family, the local government in Xiangtan was facing increasing pressure to reopen the criminal investigation. By the end of May, the Hunan provincial police stepped in, and Jiang Juwu was arrested. In a well-meaning, but ultimately misguided attempt to show the public some transparency, the Xiangtan police became the first in the country to open an online message board, hoping to answer questions the public had about the case. However, it was quickly shut down when it received a deluge of abuse, accusations of corruption, and death threats from an angry public. The family of Jiang Juwu also became the targets of hate campaigns, receiving endless death threats and requiring police protection. In order to try and quell the anger the case was stirring in the public, a third autopsy was set to go ahead, and a doctor from the top forensic laboratory in the country, Hu Zhiqiang, was brought in to conduct it. After completing his own autopsy and appraising the 2 prior examinations, he concluded that the death of Huang Jing was not natural, but frustratingly was unable to state with any certainty the actual cause of death. He described the results of the first autopsy as lacking in objectivity and false, going on to state the results of the second autopsy had no pathological basis. Unhappy that their expertise was being questioned, the Xiangtan Medical Office refused to accept the conclusion of Hu Zhiqiang, maintaining the death was due to natural causes. This only further stoked anger in people following the case, and Beijing got involved, ordering a 5th autopsy. Professor Ai Xiaoming contacted a colleague of hers at Zhongshan University to help. Professor Chen Yuchuan had recently become known around the country due to his work in the Sun Zhigang incident in Guangzhou. In what would be a video in of itself, the 27-year-old university graduate Sun Zhigang was arrested by police in Guangzhou for not having a temporary residence permit. While being detained, he was transferred to the psychiatric ward of the detention center and died in custody. Much like in the Huang Jing case, the cause of death was originally put down as an acute heart attack. The autopsy performed by Chen Yuchuan, after complaints from the family, would later prove the victim had been beaten to death by 2 inmates over a 9-hour period. The professor had exposed an attempted police cover-up to prevent them from being blamed for the death, placing a man detained for a minor offense in a room with 2 mentally unstable violent offenders. Professor Ai Xiaoming and Huang Shuhua went to see him in Guangdong to show him the case files and various autopsy reports. Looking over the information, Chen Yuchuan agreed that there was a case for another investigation, and traveled to Hunan to perform the autopsy. While it was easy enough to point fingers at the police for an attempted cover-up, the Public Security Bureau in Xiangtan had suspicions about Jiang Juwu from the start, and now with pressure coming direct from Beijing, they were even more intent on getting to the truth. The suspect was still being held in detention and interrogated about what exactly happened that night. There were several key points police believed they still hadn't been given reasonable explanations for. When making his preliminary appraisal in the dorm room, the medical examiner had suggested Huang Jing had been dead for a while. Unable to give an exact time frame, it seemed to be longer than the hour it took between Jiang Juwu getting home and making the first phone call to Huang Jing. This would obviously mean Huang Jing was already dead before he left, and it was hard to believe this wasn't noticed by Jiang Juwu. He also couldn't explain the positioning of the quilt. It would have been disturbed when Jiang Juwu got out of bed, but it was found neatly laid over Huang Jing. It suggested that the sheet had been placed over her, and she remained motionless after that. The police were further unsatisfied for both his suggestions for the bruising found on the back of the knees. Despite being in an unusual location, they were very noticeable, perhaps even more so given the strange area. Jiang Juwu admitted the pair got naked and engaged in intimate activity, so police found it questionable he either didn't notice them or couldn't recall how they got there. But as with all attempts to try and get some answers in the case, there was only frustration. Jiang Juwu claimed ignorance or simply said he couldn't remember. Head of the Public Security Bureau in Xiangtan gave the okay for the next autopsy to take place, but when Chen Yuchuan arrived with his team, they were stopped from entering the mortuary by the Medical Bureau. The head of the Public Security Bureau, in attempts to stop the accusations of corruption being levied at his department, had stated that no member of the Xiangtan Medical Examiner's Office was to be present at the procedure. Angered, the Medical Examiner's Office tried to stop the autopsy from going ahead, and refused to allow the new team access to the body. It was quickly made very clear that anyone attempting to obstruct Chen Yuchuan and his team would face criminal charges, and the office had to relent. Once they were granted access to the body, Chen Yuchuan was shocked with the sight that greeted him. The body of Huang Jing had suspiciously been allowed to degrade, to such an extent that determining a cause of death would be next to impossible. Fortunately, specimens that were being held by the Public Security Bureau had been properly preserved, allowing Chen Yuchuan to at the very least examine the heart. His report would state that the heart showed no signs of Huang Jing having any kind of heart disease or defects, and nothing to suggest she died of heart failure or pulmonary infarction. Chen Yuchuan would later discover that the original medical team examining the body had done so under natural lighting, and supposedly identified signs of thrombosis by eye, which in his opinion was highly unprofessional and unlikely to get accurate results. With two independent forensic examiners both concluding that Huang Jing did not die of natural causes, the Xiangtan police appealed to the courts for the criminal prosecution of the boyfriend. A major issue was what they could prosecute him for. There was no cause of death, so intentional homicide wasn't an option. All forensic examinations of the body stated the hymen was intact, so it made the possibility that the victim was forcibly violated unlikely. Furthermore, the suspect still hadn't confessed, and would go on to retract all statements he'd given to police. Eventually, on the 22nd of December 2003, it was decided that Jiang Junhui would be prosecuted under a charge which would be equivalent to causing death by misadventure. By now the Huang family, with help by donations from supporters, and the efforts and connections of Ai Xiaoming and Hu Jie, had the Director of Civil and Constitutional Rights of Tsinghua University representing them. Wu Ge made one final attempt to discover what caused the death of Huang Jing. He requested the Shanghai Ministry of Justice perform an examination of the body and all samples, along with investigating the work of the Xiangtan Medical Bureau. The team from Shanghai arrived in Xiangtan on March 22, 2004, looking to examine the organs of the victim. Requesting to see the heart, they were stunned when informed it had been destroyed by staff at the Medical Bureau, after the examination performed by Chen Yuchuan. The claim by the Xiangtan Medical Examiner's Office was that the heart, which was being preserved in formaldehyde, had been sealed in the bucket containing it improperly, and as winter came and the heating was turned on, the fluid evaporated, the specimen drying out leaving it no use to anyone, so the decision was made to incinerate it. The news was met with incredulity and anger. The Huang family had spent their life savings on preserving their daughter's body, when it wasn't being considered a criminal case. The bill had then been taken on by the Xiangtan police, after Jiang Junhui was arrested and an official suspect. The team from Shanghai found it unbelievable that such a level of incompetence could be displayed, but it changed nothing. The body of Huang Jing had been improperly stored and was in an advanced state of decomposition, and now crucial samples had been destroyed. With this news, China's Supreme Court stepped in, after appeals from Huang Shuhua and her supporters. A committee was established in an attempt to determine a cause of death from the police investigation and the work of the previous autopsies. The 5-member committee made up of the country's top forensic pathologists all agreed that the death of Huang Jing was unnatural, and based on the evidence they concluded that she died of some kind of mechanical asphyxiation as the couple engaged in outercourse. In their appraisal, they concluded that while the couple were being intimate, there was significant pressure placed on the chest of Huang Jing, severely restricting her ability to breathe, until she finally suffocated. On December 7, 2004, Jiang Junhui would go on trial for his part in the death of Huang Jing. Due to security concerns, the proceedings were held behind closed doors. However, without a confession and actual cause of death, the court could do little more than say Jiang Junhui bore part of the civil liability for the death of Huang Jing, and would be ordered to pay compensation to the Huang family. The verdict was met with obvious anger, and outside the courts Jiang Junhui was approached by a cousin of Huang Jing, and warned even though he was walking out a free man, he shouldn't get complacent. A scuffle broke out between the two men, and then the families, which the police had to step in and break up. The verdict also angered the lawyers involved in the case, Wu Ge describing it as completely arbitrary and unreasonable. Saying a verdict such as this is only usually reserved for employers who have a worker die due to safety regulations being ignored. The Huang family wasted little time in launching an appeal against the verdict. In the aftermath of the trial, the case would be featured on a number of television documentaries broadcast nationwide. Jiang Juwu made the very misguided decision to give interviews in an attempt to clear his name, but his appearances had the opposite effect. He now claimed that when he was getting intimate with Huang Jing, her trousers remained on the entire time, contradicting all previous statements he made, and only led to questions about why she was found naked in bed. But it was when he was asked about exactly what happened that night, there'd be an extremely negative reaction towards him. Understandably, since it was a private moment, and the interview would be broadcast on national TV, he refused to go into detail. He let slip a slight chuckle as he spoke about it. This could have been down to embarrassment or nervousness, but in the eyes of many viewers, the moment was equivalent to an admission of guilt.
The
interview then took a strange turn when he was questioned about his claim Huang Jing suffered some kind of seizure that night. The reporter asked why he didn't insist on Huang Jing seeing a doctor after such a medical episode. He responded by saying he'd been pampered and somewhat spoiled as a child, and as a result was still quite immature, and just didn't know what he was supposed to do in a situation like that. His father then stepped in and took over answering questions. While his father spoke, Jiang Juwu quietly got up, walked over to a corner of the room to the family computer, and started surfing the internet as if the TV crew weren't there. Huang Shuhua continued fighting to get justice for her daughter. She devoted all her time working the case, reading books about forensic science, the law, and carried around a book containing photos she was finally given from her daughter's various autopsies. She spent hours poring over the gruesome images trying to find some evidence that showed how her daughter's life was ended. She'd even set up a small office in her home, staffed by volunteers who gave up their time to help her case. But on the 8th of December 2008, her fight would come to an end. Almost 5 years after the death of her daughter, the ruling over her appeal was announced. The appeal to get Jiang Juwu criminally prosecuted was rejected and the original ruling was upheld. With no new evidence to present to the court, there was nothing to prove that Jiang Juwu was directly responsible for the death of Huang Jing. As a result, he was ordered to compensate the Huang family only 50,000 yuan. Ai Xiaoming and Hu Jie started documenting the case early in 2003 and followed the efforts of Huang Shuhua over the subsequent years. They released the first part of the almost 3-hour documentary in 2005, naming it Paradise Garden, after the online memorial which helped build up public support for the Huang family. There would be 2 more parts to the documentary following the appeal decision and its aftermath. Professor Ai Xiaoming made numerous TV appearances debating the flaws in the legal process, which would actually help lead to a change in the law. A new standardized judicial appraisal agency was established that would deal with disputed cases independently and objectively. The makers of the documentary would go on to produce further films, highlighting other controversial incidents in the country, the most notable being the Wukan village incident in Guangdong, where riots broke out due to massive corruption of members of the local government committee. Huang Jing was laid to rest without anyone knowing exactly what caused her death, and many questions left unanswered. Frustratingly, it seems the mystery will never be truly solved. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. And hope to see you again for the next dark tale from the Middle Kingdom.